Millionaire stops. His BMW for a homeless girl, no one could imagine what would happen to her in the next moments. Her days were counted. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the bustling city streets, its rays reflecting off the sleek black BMW caught in the slow-moving traffic. Inside, Alexander Reeves adjusted his luxury watch, a habit born of impatience rather than necessity. His eyes wandered to the sidewalk, observing the flow of people going about their day. That's when he saw her. A skinny girl, no more than 10 years old, stood barefoot on the cracked pavement. Her clothes were tattered, her feet bruised and dirty. In her trembling hands, she held a piece of cardboard with a message scrawled in shaky letters. "Please help me. My mother is sick." Alexander blinked, his chest tightening as if an invisible hand had gripped his heart. The world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only the girl in sharp focus. Her pleading eyes met his, and suddenly, he wasn't seeing a stranger on the street anymore. He was seeing himself. Memories flooded back, unbidden and overwhelming. Alexander was 7 years old again, standing in the cold kitchen of their run-down apartment. His mother lay unconscious on the floor, her face pale and drawn. Fear, hunger, and desperation clawed at his insides as he ran out into the street, tugging at the clothes of passers-by, begging for help. No one had stopped for him that day. Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he made a decision. He wouldn't be another face in the crowd, another pair of eyes that looked away. Not this time. With a swift movement, he pulled the car over to the curb, ignoring the honks of protest from the vehicles behind him. He stepped out, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the grime-covered sidewalk. The girl's eyes widened as he approached, her grip on the cardboard sign tightening. Alexander knelt down to her level, his voice gentle as he asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face before she whispered, "Maria." "Maria," Alexander repeated softly. "Where's your mother?" Maria pointed, down a narrow alley, where dilapidated buildings cast long shadows over piles of discarded trash. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he might find. "Let's go to her," he said, offering his hand to Maria. The girl blinked in surprise as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. People never asked. They never cared. But here was this man in his expensive suit, ready to step into her world. As they walked towards the alley, Alexander felt the eyes of passers-by on them. He knew what they must be thinking. What was a man like him doing with a girl like her? But he pushed those thoughts aside. All that mattered now was helping Maria and her mother. Little did Alexander know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only Maria's life, but his own as well. As they disappeared into the shadows of the alley, the bustling city continued its relentless pace, unaware that a story of compassion, redemption, and hope was about to unfold in its midst. The alley was a world away from the gleaming streets Alexander was accustomed to. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of decay and desperation. Broken glass crunched beneath his polished shoes as he followed Maria deeper into the maze of crumbling buildings. Maria moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew every crack and crevice of this forgotten place. She led Alexander to a dilapidated structure that might have once been an apartment building. Now it was little more than a shell, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. "This way," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She guided Alexander through a gap in the boards into a dark, musty interior. The transition from the bright afternoon sun to the gloomy interior left Alexander momentarily blind. As his eyes adjusted, he became aware of the sounds around him, scurrying rats, distant arguments, and the persistent drip of water from unseen leaks. Maria tugged at his sleeve, urging him forward. They climbed a set of creaking stairs, each step threatening to give way beneath their feet. On the third floor, Maria stopped in front of a door hanging off its hinges. "This is where we live," she said, a note of shame in her voice. Alexander steeled himself as they entered the tiny room. The smell hit him first, a mixture of illness, unwashed bodies, and hopelessness. A thin, filthy mattress lay on the floor, and on it, Alexander's breath caught in his throat, There, barely visible in the dim light filtering through a grimy window, lay Maria's mother. She was a frail figure, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Sweat glistened on her forehead, and her eyes were closed, her face contorted, in pain. Maria rushed to her mother's side, taking her hand. "Mommy," she said softly, "I've brought help." The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever. She tried to speak, but only a weak cough escaped her lips. Alexander stood frozen, the scene before him merging with a memory he'd tried so hard to bury. He saw his own mother lying there, sick and helpless, while he stood by unable to do anything. But this time was different. This time he could change the ending. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance," he told Maria. "Your mother needs a hospital." As he dialed, Alexander noticed Maria's eyes widen with fear. "But we can't afford," she began. "Don't worry about that," Alexander cut her off gently. "I'll take care of everything." While they waited for the ambulance, Alexander knelt beside the mattress, taking in the full extent of their living conditions. The room was bare, save for a few meager possessions, some worn clothes, a couple of thin blankets, and a small box that seemed to contain all of Maria and her mother's worldly belongings. "How long have you been living like this?" he asked Maria softly. The girl shrugged, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. "A long time, since Daddy left." Alexander felt a surge of anger at the unknown man who had abandoned his family to such a fate. But before he could ask more, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Minutes later, paramedics burst into the room, their efficient movements a blur as they assessed Maria's mother and prepared her for transport. Alexander watched as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her frail body looking even smaller amidst the medical equipment. As they began to move her out, Maria's composure finally broke. She grabbed onto Alexander's sleeve, her eyes filling with tears. "If they take her and I can't go with her, I won't be able to do it. I'll be all alone." Alexander looked down at the girl, seeing in her eyes the same fear and desperation he had felt all those years ago. Without hesitation, he knelt down to her level, placing his hands on her shoulders. "You're going with her," he said firmly. "You're not alone anymore, I promise." As they followed the paramedics out of the building, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed. He had come into this alley as a successful businessman, detached from the struggles of those less fortunate. But as he helped Maria into the ambulance, he realized he was leaving as something else, a man reconnecting with his past and perhaps finding a new purpose. The ambulance doors closed, and Alexander watched it speed away, its sirens piercing the afternoon air. He stood there for a moment, the weight of his decision settling over him. Then, with a deep breath, he turned and walked back to his car. There was much to be done, and this was only the beginning. The stark fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor cast harsh shadows as Alexander paced back and forth. The antiseptic smell and the hushed urgency of medical staff brought back memories he'd long suppressed. Memories of another hospital, another vigil, and a very different outcome. Maria sat curled up in a plastic chair, her small frame dwarfed by the institutional furniture. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, followed Alexander's movements. The fear and uncertainty on her face tugged at his heart. "Mr. Reeves." A doctor, in crisp scrubs, approached them, clipboard in hand. Alexander straightened, acutely aware of Maria's gaze upon him. "Yes, that's me." "How is she?" The doctor's expression was neutral, practiced. "Maria's mother is stable, but her condition is serious. She's suffering from severe pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and overall poor health. We've started her on antibiotics and fluids, but her recovery will take time." Alexander nodded, processing the information. "But she will recover." A small smile broke through the doctor's professional demeanor. "With proper care and time, yes, we expect her to make a full recovery." At these words, Maria let out a small sob of relief. Alexander knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Did you hear that, Maria? Your mom's going to be okay." Maria nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She's resting now, but you can see her briefly. Just remember, she needs her rest to get better." As Maria followed a nurse to her mother's room, Alexander turned back to the doctor. "I'll be covering all the expenses for their care," he said quietly, "and I want them to receive the best treatment possible." The doctor's eyebrows raised slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. We'll ensure they receive excellent care." Left alone in the corridor, Alexander pulled out his phone. He had calls to make, arrangements to set in motion. As he dialed his assistant's number, he couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn his day had taken. This morning, he had been Alexander Reeves, millionaire businessman, concerned only with board meetings and profit margins. Now, he found himself responsible for the lives of two strangers, a sick woman and her daughter, both of whom had been invisible to him just hours ago. "Sarah, it's Alex. I need you to clear my schedule for the next few days. Something's come up." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "And I need you to find me a good social worker, someone discreet who can handle a delicate situation." As he ended the call, Alexander caught sight of his reflection in the polished surface of a vending machine. The man staring back at him looked tired, his expensive suit incongruous in the stark hospital setting, but there was something else there too, a spark in his eyes that had been missing for far too long. For the first time in years, Alexander felt truly alive. He had a purpose beyond the pursuit of wealth and status. He had a chance to make a real difference in someone's life, just as he had once wished someone would do for him. But as he watched, Maria returned from her mother's room. Her small hand clutched tightly in the nurse's. Alexander realized that this was more than just a chance to do good. It was a chance at redemption, not just for Maria and her mother, but for himself as, well, the road ahead would not be easy. He knew that helping Maria and her mother went beyond simply paying for their medical care. Their lives had been shaped by poverty and hardship, and extricating them from that cycle would require more than just money. It would require time, patience, and a commitment he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet, as Maria's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of hope and fear, Alexander knew he couldn't turn back. He had opened this door, and now he had to see it through wherever it might lead. "Ready to go, Maria?" he asked gently. The girl nodded, her small hand slipping into his, as naturally as if they'd known each other for years. As they walked out of the hospital into the fading afternoon light, Alexander felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But along with it came a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This was just the beginning of their journey together. And Alexander had no idea where it would lead. But he was certain of one thing: his life would never be the same again. The drive from the hospital to Alexander's penthouse apartment was a study in contrasts. Maria sat quietly in the passenger seat of his BMW, her wide eyes taking in the transition from run-down neighborhoods to gleaming high-rises. Alexander couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked, her tattered clothes and unwashed hair a stark reminder of the world she came from. As they pulled into the underground parking of his building, Alexander realized he hadn't thought this through. What was he doing bringing a homeless child into his immaculate, sterile life? But it was too late for doubts now. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent, Maria pressing herself into the corner, clearly overwhelmed. When the doors opened directly into Alexander's apartment, the girl's mouth fell open in awe. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. Modern art adorned the walls and sleek, minimalist furniture filled the spacious living area. It was a world away from the squalid room Maria had called home. "This is where you live?" Maria whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. Alexander nodded, suddenly embarrassed by the opulence surrounding them. "Yes, this is my home." He hesitated, then added, "And you'll be staying here while your mother recovers." Maria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really? But why are you doing all this for us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Alexander walked to the window, gathering his thoughts as he looked out over the city. How could he explain to this child the complex emotions driving his actions? Because, he began slowly, A long time ago, I was in a situation very similar to yours, and no one helped me then. He turned back to Maria, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. I have a chance now to be the person I needed back then. Maria nodded solemnly, seeming to understand more than her years would suggest. What happened to you? She asked softly. Alexander sighed, memories he'd long suppressed bubbling to the surface. That's a story for another time, he said gently. For now, let's get you settled in. You must be hungry. As if on cue, Maria's stomach growled loudly, causing her to blush. Alexander couldn't help but chuckle. I'll take that as a yes. How about we order some pizza? Maria's eyes lit up at the suggestion, and for the first time since they'd met, Alexander saw a genuine smile spread across her face. It was a beautiful sight, one that made his heart ache with a mixture of joy and sadness. As they waited for the pizza to arrive, Alexander showed Maria to the guest room. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the plush, queen-sized bed, the ensuite bathroom, and the walk-in closet. This is all for me, she asked in disbelief. Alexander nodded. For as long as you need it. Tomorrow we'll go shopping to get you some new clothes and anything else you might need. Maria's hand trailed over the soft comforter, her expression a mixture of longing and hesitation. I've never slept in a bed like this before, she admitted quietly. The simple statement hit Alexander like a physical blow. How many other children were out there, he wondered, who had never known the simple comfort of a proper bed? The arrival of the pizza momentarily pushed these heavy thoughts aside. As they sat at the dining table, Alexander couldn't help but smile at Maria's obvious delight in the simple meal. She ate with the enthusiasm of someone who had known true hunger, savoring every bite. As the evening wore on, Alexander found himself facing a new challenge: how to entertain a child. His apartment, for all its luxury, was hardly child-friendly. There were no toys, no games, nothing that might interest a young girl. But Maria seemed content simply to explore, running her hands over the smooth surfaces of his furniture, peering out the windows at the city below. Her curiosity was infectious, and Alexander found himself seeing his home through new eyes. As bedtime approached, a new awkwardness settled over them. The routine of putting a child to bed was utterly foreign to Alexander. But Maria, perhaps, sensing his discomfort, took charge. I can tuck myself in, she said with a small smile. I've been doing it for a long time. The statement, delivered so matter-of-factly, broke Alexander's heart all over again. Well, he said, clearing his throat of the sudden lump that had formed, tonight how about I tuck you in? Maria's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded shyly. As Alexander pulled the covers up to Maria's chin, he felt a surge of protectiveness. This child, who had known so much hardship in her short life, was now under his care. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to make a real difference. Good night, Maria, he said softly. Sleep well. You're safe here. The next morning, Alexander woke to the unfamiliar sound of small feet padding across hardwood floors. For a moment, he was disoriented, the events of the previous day feeling like a distant dream. Then reality crashed back in, and he remembered Maria. He found her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room, her small form silhouetted against the early morning light. She turned as he entered, her face a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. Good morning, Alexander said, trying to inject warmth into his voice. Did you sleep well? Maria nodded, her eyes darting around the room as if she still couldn't quite believe where she was. The bed was so soft, she said quietly. I've never slept like that before. Alexander felt a now familiar pang in his chest. Every innocent comment from Maria served as a stark reminder of the vast gulf between their worlds. He cleared his throat, pushing aside the emotion. Are you hungry? We should get some breakfast. As they sat at the kitchen island, Alexander realized he had no idea what children ate for breakfast. His own morning routine usually consisted of black coffee and maybe a protein bar on the go, but surely that wouldn't do for a growing child. What would you like to eat? He asked, hoping his uncertainty wasn't too obvious. Maria's eyes widened at being given a choice. Can I have cereal?" she asked hesitantly, as if afraid the request might be too much. "Of course," Alexander replied, relieved at the simple request. But as he opened his pantry, he realized, with a sinking feeling, that he didn't have any cereal. His shelves were stocked with quinoa, protein powder, and other health foods, nothing a child would want. "I'm sorry, Maria," he said, turning back to her. "I don't have any cereal. But how about we go out for breakfast? We can get you some new clothes afterward." Maria nodded, her expression a mixture of disappointment and excitement at the prospect of going out. As they walked down the busy street, Alexander couldn't help but notice the stares they were attracting. His tailored suit and Maria's worn, ill-fitting clothes made for a striking contrast. He felt a surge of protectiveness, resisting the urge to glare at those whose gazes lingered too long on the girl. At a nearby diner, Maria's eyes lit up at the sight of pancakes piled high with syrup and whipped cream. Alexander, watching her eat with undisguised joy, felt a warmth spreading through his chest. When was the last time he had taken such pleasure in a simple meal? After breakfast, they made their way to a nearby department store. Maria hung back as they entered, clearly overwhelmed by the vast array of clothing and the bustling crowds. "It's okay," Alexander reassured her, gently guiding her towards the children's section. "Pick out whatever you like." At first, Maria was hesitant, fingering the soft fabrics of new clothes with a mixture of longing and disbelief. But as Alexander continued to encourage her, she gradually grew more confident, selecting items with growing enthusiasm. By the time they left the store, Maria was outfitted in new jeans, a bright yellow t-shirt, and sneakers that actually fit her feet. The transformation was remarkable. She looked like any other happy, well-cared-for child. As they walked back to the apartment, shopping bags in hand, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was Sarah, his assistant. "Mr. Reeves, I've arranged for a social worker to meet with you this afternoon as you requested. Her name is Elena Rodriguez. She'll be at your office at 2 p.m. Alexander thanked her, ending the call with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew he needed professional help to navigate this situation, but the thought of explaining his actions to a stranger was daunting. Back at the apartment, Maria twirled in front of the mirror, admiring her new clothes. Her smile was radiant, and for a moment Alexander forgot about his worries. Seeing the joy on her face made everything else seem insignificant, but reality soon intruded. "Maria," he said gently, "I have to go to my office for a meeting this afternoon. Will you be okay here by yourself for a few hours?" Maria's smile faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. I guess so," she said, her voice small. Alexander felt a twinge of guilt. He couldn't just leave her alone, could he? But what choice did he have? He couldn't exactly bring her to a meeting with a social worker. "I won't be gone long," he promised. "And look, I'll show you how to use the TV. You can watch whatever you like." As he demonstrated the use of the remote control, Alexander marveled at how quickly his life had changed. Just days ago, his biggest concern had been closing a multi-million-dollar deal. Now he was worrying about leaving a child alone and whether she knew how to operate a television. When it was time for him to leave, Maria stood by the door, looking small and vulnerable in her new clothes. "You'll come back, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Of course, he thought, she's used to people leaving and not coming back. He knelt down to her level, looking her in the eye. "I promise, Maria, I will always come back." As he rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Alexander felt the weight of that promise settling on his shoulders. He had made a commitment to this child, one he intended to keep. But as he drove towards his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. What did he really know about taking care of a child? And what would happen when Maria's mother recovered? The future was full of uncertainties, and for the first time in years, Alexander Reeves felt completely out of his depth. Alexander's office felt different as he walked in that afternoon. The sleek, modern space that had always been a source of pride now seemed cold and impersonal. He found himself wondering what Maria would think of it, imagining her wide-eyed wonder at this view from his top-floor window. Mr. Reeves. His assistant's voice brought him back to the present. Ms. Rodriguez is here to see you. Elena Rodriguez was not what Alexander had expected. Instead of the stern, bureaucratic type he had imagined, she was a warm-faced woman, in her 40s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence. Mr. Reeves, she said, shaking his hand firmly, I understand you have an unusual situation on your hands. Alexander gestured for her to take a seat, settling into his own chair with a sigh. That's putting it mildly, Ms. Rodriguez. I'm not even sure where to begin. Eleanor smiled encouragingly. Why don't you start from the beginning? Tell me how you met Maria and her mother. As Alexander recounted the events of the past 2 days, he found himself revealing more than he had intended. He told Elena about his own childhood, about the memory of his mother that Maria had stirred up. As he spoke, he realized how much he had been holding inside, how much this situation had affected him. Elena listened attentively, her expression sympathetic but professional. When Alexander finished, she was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. Mr. Reeves, she began, your desire to help Maria and her mother is admirable, but I have to be frank with you. This is a complex situation, one that requires more than just good intentions and financial resources. Alexander nodded, feeling a mixture of relief at her honesty and apprehension at what was to come. Maria and her mother have been living in extreme poverty, Elena continued. The trauma of that experience doesn't disappear overnight, even with a change in circumstances. And while your help is invaluable, we need to consider the long-term implications of your involvement in their lives. What do you mean? Alexander asked, a defensive note creeping into his voice. Elena leaned forward, her expression kind but serious. Mr. Reeves, you've formed a connection with Maria, which is wonderful, but we need to be careful about creating dependencies or unrealistic expectations. What happens when her mother recovers? Have you thought about what your role will be then? The questions hit Alexander hard. He realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. In his mind, he had been focused on the immediate needs: food, shelter, medical care. The future had been a hazy, undefined concept. I don't know, he admitted. I just knew I had to help. Elena nodded understandingly. That's a natural response, and it's clear your heart is in the right place. But now we need to think strategically. We need to put a plan in place that will help Maria and her mother in the long term, not just the immediate future. For the next hour, Eleanor outlined a comprehensive plan. It involved therapy for both Maria and her mother, education and job, training programs, and a gradual transition to independent living. Alexander listened intently, realizing with each passing minute how naive his initial approach had been. Mr. Reeves, Eleanor said as their meeting drew to a close, I want to commend you for reaching out for professional help. Many people in your position would have tried to handle this on their own, which often leads to more harm than good. Alexander nodded, feeling both overwhelmed and relieved. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. I realize now how much I didn't know. But I want to do this right, for Maria and her mother. As Eleanor gathered her things to leave, she paused, fixing Alexander with a penetrating gaze. There's one more thing, Mr. Reeves. In situations like this, it's not uncommon for the helper to find themselves changed by the experience. Are you prepared for that? The question caught Alexander off guard. He thought about how much his life had already changed in just 2 days, how his priorities had shifted, how his view of the world had been altered. I think, he said slowly, that change might be exactly what I need. After Elena left, Alexander sat in his office for a long time, staring out at the city sprawled below. The meeting had given him a lot to think about, and he felt both daunted by the task ahead and strangely exhilarated by the challenge. His phone buzzed, reminding him that he had promised Maria he wouldn't be gone long. As he gathered his things to leave, Alexander realized that for the first time in years, he was eager to get home. Not to his expensive apartment or his luxurious possessions, but to the little girl waiting for him, the one who had unknowingly set him on this new path. As he rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Alexander felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. Alexander returned home to find Maria curled up on the couch, fast asleep with the TV still on. The sight made him pause, a lump forming in his throat. In sleep, she looked even younger, more vulnerable. He gently draped a blanket over her, careful not to wake her. As he moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Alexander's heart raced as he answered, fearing bad news about Maria's mother. "Mr. Reeves?" The doctor's voice was calm, professional. "I'm calling about Lucia Gomez, Maria's mother." "Is everything all right?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with concern. "Actually, yes. Mrs. Gomez has made a remarkable recovery. Her fever has broken, and her vitals have stabilized. We believe she'll be ready for discharge in a couple of days." Alexander leaned against the counter, relief washing over him. "That's wonderful news, Doctor, thank you." As he ended the call, Alexander's relief was quickly replaced by a new anxiety. Lucia's recovery was faster than anyone had anticipated. In just 2 days, Maria would be reunited with her mother. And then what? He glanced at the sleeping girl on his couch. In the short time she'd been with him, Maria had become more than just a charity case. He cared about her, wanted to protect her. The thought of her returning to the streets made his stomach churn, but he also knew he couldn't just keep her. That wasn't how this worked. Elena's words from earlier echoed in his mind. They needed a long-term plan, one that would truly help Maria and her mother build a better life. Lost in thought, Alexander didn't notice Maria stirring until she was standing in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You came back," she said softly, a hint of surprise in her voice. Alexander's heart clenched at the realization that she had doubted him even after his promise. "Of course I did," he said gently. "I always will." Maria nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "What's for dinner?" As they ate the pasta Alexander had prepared, with more than a little help from a YouTube tutorial, he debated how to tell Maria about her mother. He didn't want to get her hopes up too high, in case there were complications. But he also couldn't keep the news from her. "Maria," he said finally, setting down his fork, "I have some news about your mum." The girl's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. Alexander quickly continued, "It's good news. The doctors say she's doing much better. In fact, she might be able to leave the hospital in a couple of days." Maria's reaction was not what he expected. Instead of joy, her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. Hey, Alexander said, moving to kneel beside her chair. "What's wrong? I thought you'd be happy." Maria sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I am happy," she said, her voice wavering. "But does this mean I have to leave? Go back to where we were before?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. Of course, that's what she would think. In her experience, good things didn't last. People didn't help without expecting something in return. "No, Maria," he said firmly, taking her small hands in his. "You and your mom aren't going back there. I promised I'd help, remember, and I meant it." Maria looked at him, hope warring with disbelief in her eyes. "But how?" It was a valid question, one that Alexander didn't have a complete answer to yet, but he knew he had to give her something concrete, something to hold on to. "Well," he said, thinking fast, "for starters, you and your mum will stay here until we can find you a nice apartment of your own, and I'll help your mum find a job so you'll have money for food and clothes and everything else you need." He paused, seeing the doubt still lingering in Maria's eyes. "I know it's hard to believe, Maria, but I swear to you, things are going to be different from now on. You're not alone anymore." Maria's lower lip trembled, and then suddenly she was in his arms, her small body shaking with sobs. Alexander held her close, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. As Maria's sobs subsided, Alexander realized that this moment was a turning point. He had made a promise not just to Maria but to himself. He was committing to changing these lives, to making a real difference. But even as he comforted Maria, a part of him wondered, was he ready for this? Could he really follow through on such a massive commitment? The doubt nagged at him, a persistent whisper in the back of his mind. Yet looking down at the little girl in his arms, Alexander knew he couldn't turn back now, whatever challenges lay ahead whatever sacrifices he might have to make. He was in this for the long haul. As they sat there, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, Alexander felt a shift within himself. The man he had been, focused solely on wealth and status, was fading away. In his place was someone new, someone determined to use his resources and privilege to make a real difference in the world. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be obstacles, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But in that moment, holding Maria close, Alexander Reeves made a silent vow. He would see this through no matter what it took, because sometimes the most unexpected turns in life lead us exactly where we need to be. The day of Lucia's discharge. From the hospital dawned bright and clear. Alexander had spent the previous evening explaining to Maria what would happen, trying to prepare her for the reunion with her mother. The girl had listened with wide eyes, a mixture of excitement and anxiety evident in her fidgeting hands. As they drove to the hospital, Alexander couldn't help but feel nervous himself. He had spoken to Lucia briefly on the phone, but this would be their first face-to-face meeting. How would she react to him? Would she accept his help, or would she be suspicious of his motives? Maria practically bounced out of the car when they arrived, her earlier anxiety replaced by eager anticipation. Alexander followed more slowly, his mind racing with all the possibilities of how this meeting could go. They found Lucia sitting on the edge of her hospital bed, dressed in clean clothes that Alexander had arranged to be brought to her. She looked pale and thin, but her eyes lit up when she saw Maria. "Mama!" Maria cried, rushing into her mother's arms. Alexander hung back, giving them a moment of privacy. He watched as Lucia held her daughter close, murmuring soft words in Spanish. The love between them was palpable, and Alexander felt a twinge of something, envy, longing, in his chest. After a few moments, Lucia looked up, her eyes meeting Alexander's. There was gratitude in her gaze, but also wariness. She gently disentangled herself from Maria's embrace and stood smoothing down her clothes. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for us." Alexander stepped forward, offering a smile he hoped was reassuring. "Please, call me Alexander. And there's no need to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." Lucia nodded, her eyes searching his face as if trying to uncover his true motives. "Maria has told me everything, about your kindness, your generosity. But I must ask, why? Why would you do all this for strangers?" The question hung in the air between them. Alexander took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would set the tone for their relationship moving forward. "Because," he began, his voice low and earnest, "a long time ago I was in a situation very similar to yours, and no one helped me then. I have a chance now to be the person I needed back then." Lucia's eyes widened slightly, surprise and understanding, flickering across her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. A nurse entered, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Gomez, we're ready to process your discharge now." As Lucia went through the discharge process, Alexander found himself alone with Maria in the hospital room. The girl looked up at him, her eyes shining with happiness. "Thank you," she said simply, slipping her small hand into his. Alexander squeezed her hand gently, a lump forming in his throat. "You're welcome, Maria." When Lucia returned, discharge papers in hand, there was a moment of awkward silence. What now? The questions seemed to hang unspoken in the air. Alexander cleared his throat. "I've arranged for us to go back to my apartment for now. We can discuss the next steps there if that's all right with you, Lucia." Lucia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, that would be fine, thank you." The ride back to Alexander's penthouse was quiet, filled with an undercurrent of tension. Maria, oblivious to the adult complexities, chattered happily about all the things she wanted to show her mother. As they entered the apartment, Alexander saw Lucia's eyes widen as she took in the luxurious surroundings. He felt a sudden pang of self-consciousness. How must this look to her? A wealthy man living alone in such opulence, while she and her daughter had been struggling on the streets. "Please make yourselves comfortable," he said, gesturing to the living room. "Can I get you anything?" Water. Tea. Lucia shook her head, sinking onto the plush sofa. Maria immediately curled up next to her, as if afraid her mother might disappear if she let go. "Mr. Reeves, Alexander," Lucia began, her voice trembling slightly. "I cannot express how grateful I am for all you've done. But I must ask, what happens now? We cannot impose on your kindness forever." Alexander took a seat across from them, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Lucia, I want to help you and Maria build a stable, secure life, not just for now, but for the long term." He went on to outline the plan he and Eleanor had discussed: job training for Lucia, education for Maria, therapy for both of them to deal with the trauma they'd experienced. As he spoke, he saw hope blooming in Lucia's eyes, tempered with a healthy dose of skepticism. "This all sounds wonderful," Lucia said when he finished, "but why? Why would you do all this for us? We are nothing to you." Alexander was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Because I know what it's like to feel helpless, to watch a parent struggle and not be able to do anything about it. Because I've been given so much in life, and it's time I use that privilege to make a real difference. And because," he added, his eyes flickering to Maria, "sometimes the most unexpected encounters can change our lives in ways we never imagined." Lucia's eyes filled with tears. She reached out, grasping Alexander's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving us hope." As the afternoon wore on, they talked more, ironing out details and addressing concerns. Alexander could see Lucia relaxing bit by bit, allowing herself to believe that this chance at a new life was real. As evening fell, Alexander ordered dinner for them all. Watching Maria and Lucia eat, their faces alight with simple joy, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. This, he realized, was what had been missing from his life. Not more money or success, but connection, purpose, the chance to make a real difference in someone's life. Later that night, after Lucia and Maria had retired to the guest room, Alexander stood at the window looking out over the city. His life had changed irrevocably in the span of a few days. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But as he turned from the window, his eyes falling on a drawing Maria had made earlier, a bright sun shining over 3 stick figures, Alexander knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Alexander threw himself into the task of helping Lucia and Maria rebuild their lives with the same determination and focus he usually reserved for business deals. With Elena's guidance, they found a suitable apartment for Lucia and Maria, not in Alexander's building, but in a safe, family-friendly neighborhood. Alexander insisted on covering the rent for the first 6 months, giving Lucia time to get on her feet without the immediate pressure of housing costs. Furnishing the apartment became an unexpected source of joy for all of them. Maria's eyes lit up as she picked out colorful bedding and curtains for her very own room. Lucia, initially, hesitant to accept such generosity, gradually allowed herself to choose items that would make their new home comfortable and welcoming. As they shopped for kitchen essentials, Alexander found himself learning things he'd never considered before. The importance of a good set of pots and pans, the simple pleasure of choosing dishes that would hold family meals. It was a world away from his usual lifestyle of takeout and restaurant dining. But the real challenges began when it came to more long-term plans. Lucia was eager to work, to contribute, but her lack of formal education and work history made finding employment difficult. Alexander reached out to his contacts, eventually securing her a position as a housekeeper in a high-end hotel. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was a start, with potential for advancement. Maria, meanwhile, needed to be enrolled in school. The fee process was more complicated than Alexander had anticipated. There were forms to fill out, vaccinations to be updated, and placement tests to be taken. He found himself spending hours navigating the public school system, a world he'd never had reason to interact with before. Through it all, Alexander was struck by Lucia's resilience and determination. Despite the challenges she faced, She approached, each day with a quiet strength that he couldn't help but admire, and Maria, with the adaptability of youth, seemed to blossom in her new environment. Her smiles came more easily, her laughter more frequent, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of tension, of misunderstanding. Cultural differences sometimes led to awkward situations. Alexander's well-meaning suggestions occasionally came across as patronizing, and Lucia's pride sometimes made it difficult for her to accept help. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day of bureaucratic hurdles and miscommunications, Alexander found himself sitting on a park bench, watching Maria play on a nearby swing set. Lucia settled beside him, her face tired but serene. "It's not easy, is it?" she said softly. "This new life we're trying to build." Alexander shook his head. "No, it's not. I'm sorry if I've made things more complicated. I'm learning as I go, too." Lucia was quiet for a moment, her eyes on her daughter. "You know, when we were living on the streets, I used to dream of a better life for Maria. But I never imagined it would come like this. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, accepting so much help from a stranger." Alexander turned to her, his expression serious. "Lucia, you're not just accepting help. You're working hard every day to build a future for you and Maria. My resources might be making it easier, but you're the one doing the real work." Lucia's eyes met his, a small smile playing on her lips. "Perhaps we're both working hard in our own ways. You've changed your whole life for us, Alexander. Don't think I haven't noticed." It was true, Alexander realized. His days, once filled with board meetings and business lunches, were now occupied with school forms and apartment hunting. His priorities had shifted in ways he never could have anticipated. "I think," he said slowly, "that this change was something I needed, even if I didn't know it." As they sat there, watching Maria swing higher and higher, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of challenges they had yet to face, but in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Maria ran over, breathless and grinning. "Can we get ice cream?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. Lucia looked at Alexander, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, smiling. "I think ice cream sounds perfect," he said. As they walked towards the nearby ice cream parlor, Maria skipping ahead, Alexander felt Lucia's hand briefly touch his arm. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Alexander nodded, words suddenly difficult to find. As they joined Maria, at the ice cream counter, each choosing their favorite flavors, he was struck by how normal it felt, how right. In the span of a few short weeks, his life had been turned upside down. But as he watched Maria and Lucia laughing over their ice cream cones, Alexander realized that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life lead us to exactly where we need to be. As weeks turned into months, a routine began to establish itself. Lucia settled into her job at the hotel, impressing her supervisors with her work ethic and attention to detail. Maria thrived in her new school, making friends and excelling in her studies, and Alexander found himself increasingly involved in their lives, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care and affection. But as their new life began to take shape, shadows from the past started to creep in. It started small, a nightmare that left Maria shaking and tearful, clinging to her mother in the middle of the night. A moment of panic for Lucia when her paycheck was delayed, old fears of homelessness resurfacing despite the safety net Alexander had provided. Alexander, too, found himself grappling with unexpected emotions. Watching Lucia and Maria's relationship, he was often reminded of his own mother, the struggles they had faced, the bond that had been forged in hardship. These memories, long suppressed, now bubbled to the surface, bringing with them a complex mix of grief, guilt, and longing. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Alexander arrived at Lucia and Maria's apartment for their weekly dinner together, a tradition that had started almost accidentally but had quickly become a highlight of all their weeks. He found Lucia in the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. Lucia, he asked gently, is everything okay? She startled, as if she'd been lost in thought. Oh, Alexander, yes, I'm fine. It's just... She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window where rain streaked the glass. Today would have been my husband's birthday, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria's father. Alexander felt a pang in his chest. In all the time he'd known them, Lucia had rarely spoken of her husband, and he had never pressed for details. I'm so sorry, Lucia, he said softly. Do you want to talk about him? Lucia was quiet for a long moment, her hands absently folding and refolding a dish towel. When she spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears. He was a good man, Alexander. A dreamer. He always talked about coming to America, building a better life for us when we finally made it here. She paused, taking a shaky breath. The reality was so much harder than we'd imagined. He worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, we barely saw him, and then one day he just didn't come home. Alexander listened, his heart aching for her pain. What happened? He asked gently. Lucia shook her head. We never knew for sure. The police said it might have been a mugging gone wrong, but they never found who did it. And suddenly, I was alone in a strange country with a young child, and no way to support us. She looked up at Alexander, her eyes shining with unshed tears. That's why your kindness means so much, Alexander. You've given us a chance at the life Miguel dreamed of for us. Without thinking, Alexander stepped forward, pulling Lucia into a gentle embrace. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, her tears finally falling. I'm so sorry, Lucia, he murmured. I had no idea. As he held her, Alexander felt a shift in his understanding of Lucia and Maria's situation. It wasn't just poverty they had been fighting, but grief, loss, and the shattering of dreams. His admiration for Lucia's strength grew even deeper. When they finally parted, Lucia wiped her eyes, offering a watery smile. I'm sorry, she said. I don't mean to burden you with all this. Alexander shook his head firmly. It's not a burden, Lucia. I want to know. I want to understand. Just then, Maria burst into the kitchen, a drawing clutched in her hand. She stopped short when she saw her mother's tear-stained face. Mama, what's wrong? Lucia knelt down, pulling her daughter close. Nothing's wrong, mi amor. I was just telling Alexander about your papa. Do you remember the stories I've told you about him? Maria nodded solemnly. You said he was brave and kind like a superhero. Lucia laughed softly, brushing Maria's hair back from her face. That's right. And you know what? I think he would be very proud of you, and of the life we're building. Now, as Alexander watched them, he felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy at being part of this family's journey, sadness for the hardships they had endured, and a renewed determination to help them not just survive, but thrive. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Alexander raised his glass in a toast. To Miguel, he said softly, may his dreams for his family be realized. Lucia's eyes filled, with tears again, but this time they were accompanied by a smile. To Miguel, she echoed, her voice strong. As they ate, the conversation flowed more freely than ever before. Lucia shared stories of her life in Mexico, of her early days with Miguel. Maria listened with wide eyes, soaking up these pieces of her family history. And Alexander, listening to their laughter and watching the love between mother and daughter, felt something shift within himself. The walls he had built around his heart, over years of focusing solely on business and success, began to crumble. He realized that in trying to help Lucia and Maria heal from their past, he was also beginning to confront his own. The loss of his mother, the hardships of his childhood, these were wounds he had long ignored, burying them under layers of ambition and material success. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander found himself lingering, reluctant to leave the warmth of this small family gathering. When he finally did say his goodbyes, Lucia caught his hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you, she said softly, for listening, for understanding, for being here. Alexander nodded, words suddenly difficult to find. As he drove home that night, the city lights blurring through the rain on his windshield, he felt as if he was seeing his life with new clarity. The past, he realized, couldn't be erased or forgotten, but perhaps with time and with love its sharp edges could be softened. And maybe, just maybe, the process of helping Lucia and Maria heal would lead to his own healing as well. As autumn painted the city in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander found himself at a crossroads. His involvement in Lucia and Maria's lives had grown deeper than he ever anticipated, and it was beginning to affect other areas of his life. His colleagues had noticed his frequent absences from the office, his distraction during meetings. There were whispers of concern, speculation about what could be occupying so much of the usually laser-focused businessman's time and attention. One crisp October morning, Alexander's assistant, Sarah, knocked on his office door. Her face was a mixture of concern and determination as she entered. "Mr. Reeves," she began, her voice careful, "the board has requested a meeting with you. They're concerned about your recent level of involvement in the company." Alexander leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping him. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "When?" he asked simply. "Tomorrow afternoon," Sarah replied. She hesitated, then added, "Alex, if you don't mind me saying so, whatever's going on with you, I hope it's worth it. I've never seen you like this before." Alexander offered her a small smile. "Thank you, Sarah. And yes, it is worth it." After she left, Alexander stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline. His mind wandered to Lucia and Maria, to the life they were building together. He thought of Maria's recent school play, where he had sat proudly in the audience next. To Lucia, cheering as Maria delivered her lines perfectly. He remembered the family dinners, the weekend outings, the simple joy of being part of something bigger than himself. Then his eyes fell on the framed awards on his wall, the symbols of his business success. He had worked so hard for so long to reach this point. Could he really consider walking away from it all? The next day, Alexander entered the boardroom with a sense of calm resolve. The faces that greeted him were a mix of concern, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. "Alexander," the board chairman began, "we've asked you here today because we're concerned about your recent distractions. Your commitment to the company seems to have wavered, and we need to understand why." Alexander took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. "I appreciate your concerns," he began, "and you're right. My priorities have shifted recently. I've become involved in a situation that has opened my eyes to a world beyond profit margins and stock prices." He went on to explain about Lucia and Maria, about the work he'd been doing to help them and others in similar situations. As he spoke, he could see the expressions around the table changing, some softening with understanding, others hardening with disapproval. "I understand this isn't what any of you expected," Alexander concluded, "and I know it's not fair to the company for me to be only half present. That's why I've made a decision." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. "I'm stepping down as CEO." The announcement was met with gasps and murmurs of shock. The chairman leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Alexander, surely we can find a compromise. Your work with this family is admirable, but—" Alexander held up a hand, silencing him. "This isn't just about one family anymore. I've realized there's so much more I could be doing with my resources, my influence. I want to start a foundation focused on helping families in situations like Lucia and Maria's, and I can't do that, while also giving this company the leadership it deserves." The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of questions, arguments, and negotiations. By the time Alexander left the boardroom, a transition plan was in place. He would stay on for 3 months to ensure a smooth handover, and then he would be free to pursue his new path. As he drove to Lucia and Maria's apartment that evening for their weekly dinner, Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee, but for the first time in years he felt truly alive, truly purposeful. He arrived to find Maria waiting eagerly at the door, a paper clutched in her hand. "Alexander, look, I got an A on my math test." Alexander scooped her up in a hug, his heart swelling with pride. That's wonderful, Maria. I knew you could do it. Lucia appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her smile faltered as she caught sight of Alexander's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Alexander set Maria down, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Nothing's wrong," he assured them both. "In fact, everything's right. I have some news to share with you both." As they sat down to dinner, Alexander explained his decision to leave his company, to start a foundation dedicated to helping families in need. Lucia listened with wide eyes, her fork forgotten in her hand. "But Alexander," she said when he finished, "your company, it's your life's work. Are you sure about this?" Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Lucia, my life's work is just beginning. What we've built here, the three of us, and this is what matters. And I want to help other families find the same hope, the same second chance." Maria, who had been listening intently, piped up, "Does this mean we'll see you even more?" Alexander laughed, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Yes, Maria, it does." As they continued their meal, the conversation flowing easily between them, Alexander felt a sense of rightness settle over him. He knew there would be challenges ahead, knew that starting a foundation from scratch would be no easy task. But looking at Lucia and Maria, seeing the hope and joy in their faces, he knew without a doubt that he was on the right path. The life he had known, the endless pursuit of wealth and status, seemed like a distant memory now. In its place was something far more valuable: purpose, connection, and the knowledge that he was making a real difference in the world. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander found himself lingering, reluctant to leave the warmth of this small family gathering. When he finally did say his goodbyes, Lucia caught his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes shining with emotion. "For everything. For believing in us, for giving us a chance, for showing us that there are still good people in this world." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, both of you, for showing me what really matters in life." As he drove home that night, the city lights twinkling around him, Alexander felt a sense of excitement building within him. The future was uncertain, but it was full of possibility, and for the first time in a very long time, he couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The next 3 months passed in a whirlwind of activity. By day, Alexander worked tirelessly to ensure a smooth transition at his company, grooming his successor and tying up loose ends. By night and on weekends, he threw himself into planning for his new foundation, reaching out to contacts in the non-profit world and studying successful models of charitable organizations. Through it all, his bond with Lucia and Maria continued to deepen. They were there to offer encouragement on the days when the enormity of what he was undertaking felt overwhelming. Their weekly dinners became a cherished respite, a reminder of why he was making this dramatic life change. As the day of his official departure from the company approached, Alexander found himself grappling with a mix of emotions. Excitement for the new chapter ahead, certainly, but also a creeping anxiety. Was he really ready for this? Could he truly make a difference on the scale he hoped to? The night before his last day at the office, Alexander found himself unable to sleep. He slipped out of bed in the early hours of the morning, padding to his home office. Almost without thinking, he found himself dialing Lucia's number. She answered. On the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Alexander, is everything okay? I'm sorry to wake you," he said, suddenly feeling foolish. I needed to talk to someone." There was a rustling sound. Then Lucia's voice came through clearer. "What's wrong?" Alexander sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I'm scared, Lucia," he admitted, the words tumbling out. "What if I'm making a huge mistake? What if I can't actually help people the way I want to? What if—" "Alexander," Lucia cut him off gently. "Take a deep breath, listen to me. You've already helped people. You've changed our lives in ways I can't even begin to express. Whatever comes next, you've already made a difference." Her words washed over him, soothing his frayed nerves. "But what if it's not enough?" he whispered. "It will be," Lucia said, firmly, "because you care." because you're willing to try. That's more than most people ever do. They talked for another hour, Lucia's calm assurance gradually easing Alexander's fears. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. "Thank you, Lucia," he said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you and Maria." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Lucia spoke, her voice warm. "We're family now, Alexander. We're in this together." Those words stayed with Alexander as he dressed for his last day at the office. Family. It had been so long since he'd had anyone he could truly call family. The thought gave him strength as he walked into the building he had called his professional home for so many years. The day passed in a blur of handshakes, well-wishes, and a few tears from longtime colleagues. As Alexander packed up the last of his personal items, he felt a surprising lightness. This office, these trappings of success, they had defined him for so long. But now, he realized, they were just things. His true self, his purpose, lay elsewhere. As he stepped out of the building for the last time, Alexander was surprised to see Lucia and Maria waiting for him on the sidewalk. Maria ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Congratulations," she cried, beaming up at him. Lucia approached more slowly, a soft smile on her face. "We thought you might need some moral support," she said. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "You have no idea how much this means to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. As they walked away from the towering office building, Alexander felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The future was still uncertain, the challenges ahead still daunting. But with Lucia and Maria by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table in Lucia and Maria's apartment, Alexander raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes shining with determination and hope. "To family," Lucia added, her gaze meeting his. "To changing the world," Maria chimed in, her young face alight with the boundless optimism of childhood. As their glasses clinked together, Alexander felt a surge of emotion. This, he realized, was the turning point he had been waiting for all his life. Not the accumulation of wealth or the climb up the corporate ladder, but this moment of connection, of purpose, of love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they might face, Alexander knew one thing with absolute certainty. Together, they could overcome anything. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be worth it. Because with every life they touched, with every family they helped, they would be creating ripples of change that would spread far beyond what any of them could imagine. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter and dreams for the future, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. He was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. The launch of the Reeves Family Foundation was met with a flurry of media attention. The story of a successful CEO leaving his position to start a charitable organization was too compelling for the press to ignore. Alexander found himself thrust into the spotlight, fielding interviews and explaining his vision for the foundation. But amidst the whirlwind of publicity, Alexander never lost sight of the foundation's true purpose. With Lucia by his side, as the foundation's co-director, they began the hard work of turning their dreams into reality. Their first initiative was a program to provide housing and job training for single parents struggling with homelessness. The program, inspired by Lucia's own experiences, aimed to give families the stability and support they needed to build better lives. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but deeply rewarding. Alexander and Lucia spent long hours poring over grant applications, meeting with city officials, and coordinating with other non-profit organizations. Maria, now thriving in school, often joined them at the foundation's offices after classes, doing her homework and offering her own unique perspective on their work. As months passed, the foundation's impact began to grow. Families who had been living in shelters or on the streets found themselves in safe, stable homes. Parents who had struggled to find work were given the skills and support they needed to secure steady employment. One crisp autumn day, almost a year after the foundation's launch, Alexander stood before a small crowd gathered outside a newly renovated apartment building. This was the foundation's first major housing project, a complex dedicated to providing affordable housing for families in need. As he cut the ribbon to officially open the building, Alexander felt a swell of emotion. He glanced at Lucia, standing nearby with Maria, and saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. They had done this. Together. This building, Alexander began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd, is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a symbol of hope, a promise that no matter how difficult life may become, there are people who care, who are willing to extend a helping hand. He went on to share the story of how the foundation had come to be, speaking of his encounter with Maria on that fateful day. As he talked, he saw heads nodding, saw tears in the eyes of some listeners. His words were resonating, touching hearts. But this is just the beginning, he concluded. There are so many more families out there who need our help. And with your support, we can reach them. We can change lives one family at a time. As applause erupted, Alexander felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down to see Maria beaming up at him, her eyes shining with pride. On his other side, Lucia squeezed his arm gently, a silent gesture of support and affection. Later that evening, as they celebrated the successful launch over a quiet dinner at home, Alexander found himself reflecting on how far they had come. Lucia, once struggling to survive on the streets, was now a confident, capable leader, her insights and experiences invaluable to the foundation's work. Maria, no longer the scared, hungry child he had first met, was blossoming into a bright, compassionate young girl with dreams of becoming a doctor to help people like Mommy and me. And Alexander himself, he hardly recognized the man he had been just a year ago. The driven, sometimes ruthless businessman had been replaced by someone more empathetic, more connected to the world around him. As they finished their meal, Lucia brought out a small cake, its candle flickering in the dim light. "Happy anniversary," she said softly. Alexander looked at her in surprise. "Anniversary?" Lucia nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. 1 year ago today, you stopped your car and changed our lives forever. I thought we should celebrate." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "You've changed my life too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you. More than you could ever know." As Maria gleefully blew out the candle, making a wish she refused to share, Alexander felt a sense of contentment wash over him. This was what true success felt like, he realized. Not the accumulation of wealth or power, but the knowledge that you had made a real, tangible difference in the world. The road ahead was still long, the challenges still numerous. But as he looked at Lucia and Maria, at the family they had become, Alexander knew that together they could face anything. They were planting seeds of change, seeds that would grow into a forest of hope for countless families in need. And as the evening wound down, filled with laughter and dreams for the future, Alexander felt a deep sense of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together, for the courage to change his life's direction, and for the love and support of the two people who had become his world. The future was bright, full of possibility, and Alexander couldn't wait to see what it would bring. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Alexander's BMW had come to a stop beside a desperate little girl on a city street. 5 years of hard work, challenges, triumphs, and profound change. The Reeves Family Foundation had grown beyond Alexander's wildest dreams. What had started as a small operation focused on helping families in their city had blossomed into a nationally recognized organization with programs spanning housing, education, job training, and healthcare. Lucia, once a struggling single mother, had become a powerful advocate for families in need. Her personal experiences and innate empathy made her an invaluable asset to the foundation. She traveled the country, speaking at conferences and meeting with policymakers, her story inspiring change at every level. Maria, now a teenager, was top of her class and had her sights set on pre-med programs at top universities. Her experiences had shaped her into a compassionate, driven young woman, determined to make a difference in the world. And Alexander, He had found a purpose and joy in life that he had never known was possible. The relentless pursuit of wealth and status that had once defined him now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was a deep sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that his life was making a real difference in the world. On a warm spring morning, Alexander stood before a crowd gathered for the opening of the Foundation's newest project, a community center in the very neighborhood where he had first met Maria and Lucia. The center would provide job training, childcare, healthcare services, and a safe space for families in need. As he prepared to give his speech, Alexander's eyes scanned the crowd. He saw faces he recognized, families the Foundation had helped over the years, now thriving and giving back to their community. Among them were Lucia and Maria, standing proudly in the front row. 5 years ago, Alexander began, his voice carrying across the hushed audience. I thought I had everything, success, wealth, power, but I was empty inside. It took a chance, encounter with a brave little girl and her incredible mother, to show me what truly matters in life. He paused, his eyes meeting Lucia's. She gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes shining with unshed tears. That day changed everything, not just for them, but for me. It opened my eyes to a world I had been blind to, a world where so many families struggle every day just to survive. But it also showed me the incredible resilience, strength and love that exists in our communities. Alexander gestured to the building behind him. This center is more than just a building. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together, when we recognize our shared humanity and our responsibility to each other. It's a promise to every family out there who's struggling. You are not alone. There is hope. There is help. As applause erupted, Alexander felt a familiar, small hand slip into his. Maria, no longer the tiny girl he had first met, but a poised young woman, smiled up at him. On his other side, Lucia squeezed his arm gently, a gesture that had become so familiar and comforting over the years. Later that evening, as they sat, around the dinner table in the home they now shared, Alexander looked at the two people who had become his family. Lucia, her face lined with the wisdom of her experiences but glowing with happiness. Maria, on the cusp of adulthood, her future bright with possibility. You know, he said softly, I used to think that success was about how much money you could make or how powerful you could become. But now I know better. Lucia reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. And what is success to you now, Alexander? He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. This, he said simply, family, purpose, the knowledge that we're making a real difference in the world. Maria grinned, her eyes twinkling. Does this mean I can ask for a bigger allowance? They all laughed, the sound filling the room with joy. As the laughter subsided, Alexander felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him, for the twist of fate that had brought them together, for the courage to change his life's direction, for the love and support of the two people who had become his world. You know, Lucia said, her voice thoughtful, when you first stopped your car that day, I was suspicious. I couldn't believe someone would help us without wanting something. In return, Alexander nodded, remembering the wariness in her eyes back then. And now? Lucia smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. Now I know that sometimes miracles do happen. Sometimes people surprise you in the most beautiful ways. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter and dreams for the future, Alexander felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The journey hadn't always been easy. There had been challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But every struggle had been worth it. He thought back to that day 5 years ago, to the man he had been then, successful by the world's standards, but empty inside. How could he have known that by stopping to help a desperate child, he would end up saving himself? Life, Alexander realized, had a funny way of bringing things full circle. What had started as an act of kindness had blossomed into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. It had given him a family, a purpose, and a joy he had never known was possible. As he looked at Lucia and Maria, at the life they had built together, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise, and whatever it might bring, they would face it together. For in the end, Alexander had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives you touch, the love you share, and the difference you make in the world. And by that measure, Alexander Reeves was the richest man in the world. You may also like one of the 2 videos on your screen. Feel free to watch them now or subscribe to the channel to watch them later. Thanks for watching.